I'm James, and this is Producing Fun, a podcast about making games from a product perspective. Welcome to Producing Fun. My guests this week are Sophie Williams and James Hewitt. Together, they run Needy Cat Games, a game studio located in Nottingham, here in the UK. Needy Cat Games is not a publisher. James and Sophie create new games, but they don't finance and market them. They also don't work like conventional game designers either. They don't go around pitching games to different companies in the hopes of being published. Rather, they create games to order based on client requests, leveraging their considerable experience working for Games Workshop and now a range of other tabletop companies. In their day-to-day work, they go well beyond the traditional remit of a designer too, considering usability, graphic design, and component count limitations laid down by clients in their work. In some projects, they will even manage graphic designers and artists themselves, completing critical tasks that sit squarely with the publisher in most situations. The game studio model is still a real rarity in the world of tabletop games. But to me, it represents an interesting new development. While Kickstarter has made more generalists than ever, self-published creators like myself, shepherding ideas all the way from back-of-envelope to shrink-wrap games sitting on store shelves, this kind of specialization is exactly the sort of thing I'm expecting to see more of in future. As Sophie and James are very honest about in this interview, there's almost no one who really has both the skills and the interest in doing every single part of this complex process. As the industry grows, and the competition for great, commercially appealing games gets ever tougher, it seems natural to me that skills will increasingly divide organizations into different specialisms. Why wouldn't people who excel at design and development just want to do that? Just as those who make financial bets on titles or specialize in marketing are likely to find their own niche over time. Sophie and James's unique experience and approach give them a deep insight into making games from a more product-orientated perspective than most designers. For anyone making games, this interview is densely packed with useful advice, from driving creativity with a tight brief, to the so-called Kickstarter treadmill and its dangers, from when and how to integrate artists and graphic designers into a design process, to a fascinating discussion on the future of the market. This is one conversation you don't want to miss. We join just as they explain what a game studio does.
So I think we're in a really unique position, aren't we, really? I mean, I can think of up to a dozen, maybe people that I know of that do similar things to what we do.
We're not a publisher. And I think that's the thing, is a lot of people think of a game studio as being someone who publishes their own games, and we don't do that.
Basically, you've got the publishers, and then there are designers, and designers, they will design a game and go and pitch it to publishers and say, we would like you to publish this game, and there's a back and forth there. What we do generally is we work with clients who already have an idea for a game, or they have an access to an IP, or they have a range of miniatures or something they would like to turn into a game, but they don't have that skill set. So what we do is we work with them to a brief, which we work out, and we create games effectively on
demand, really.
Yeah, on demand.
We create games to fulfill a brief from a client, which is very different, because I think the sort of standard way is, if you're like your stereotypical game designer, is you will design a bunch of games. So you might design one or two games, or I've heard of people who've got 10 designs all like ready to go, and they'll make sell sheets and they'll pitch them to publishers, and they'll go to meet the publisher events and they'll try and pitch their game. And publishers are going to these events, maybe making their own games, but also going, oh, well, what we want is, like, I don't know, a game for 8 to 12-year-olds that uses no more than a deck of 60 cards.
Yeah.
And
it plays $20 price point.
Yeah, and only plays in 15 minutes. And they might have a very specific need. And what they're doing is they're looking out for people who fulfill their need, who also have a great product. And that is quite difficult to do, because you're matching up whatever someone's just thought of as a cool thing to make, which is completely random. Like, amazing ideas come out of that, and some amazing things are made.
But if it's not exactly what the publisher's looking for,
then it's really difficult to get picked up.
We've both had a fair bit to do with the Tabletop Mentorship program. So, talk for him last week about what was it?
Imposter syndrome.
Imposter syndrome, how no one knows what they're doing. One of my former mentees, a woman called Danielle, she was telling me about how she was doing this crazy whistle-stop tour. She's using all of her annual leave at work to go to every convention in the US. And there's quite a big convention circuit. And she was trying to get to every single one to pitch her game. Like, everyone where a publisher was in attendance to pitch her game. I mean, she had so many games she worked on, and they were
all
great.
Fantastic games.
But she just kept being told it's not quite what we need right now. And the thing is, when you think how many designers they must see and how crowded the board games market is generally, you realise what kind of a lightning strike of luck
really
you're looking
is.
for.
And then I think you get people who self-publish either by just going and making the game themselves, or a lot of people put it on Kickstarter.
If you can think of any examples, James, speak up.
Oh, well, I'm struggling a little bit. Who would go and do such a thing as that? Something as mad as that?
But we sort of landed somewhere in the middle of all
yeah,
this,
we sort of looked at it and we realised, for all our faults and plugging away at things we don't really enjoy, like admin, we did realise early off the bat that we would not suit just making games and then trying to pitch them. That wasn't going to be a thing. And also, there's no guaranteed income there. And if we were going to start something where we were quitting our jobs to do it, because you've been doing it, well, we've both been sort of dabbling for a long time, but you'd been game designing since you were like 12 or something?
My first game was when I was 5. I found it recently. It wasn't great. I'll give myself a little bit of leeway, you know. It needed way more testing. The artwork was way off.
Maybe as your 5-year-old self hadn't really properly considered product market fit.
I think that was actually that was the key issue. And if I had the time, I'd go back and give myself a lecture. But yeah, so I think I've been designing games for a long time, and I've been doing it professionally with Games Workshop for a while. You'd had a really strong interest in game design. You'd helped me develop lots of
well,
designs.
I've done loads of play testing and development with you on all the stuff you were doing for your own like hobby for quite a long time. And then we were like, well, if this is something we're actually going to do, we need to have like a guaranteed income. But so originally we were like, oh, this will be a thing we do for a while. We'll just make games for other people while we set up systems in place so that we can self-publish through Kickstarter. And that was always our sort of original concept, wasn't it? So we were just like, oh, well, we happen to have connections within the industry. And because James had been a games designer for Games Workshop, you were like, people were coming up to you going, would you write us a game? So we were like, well, this is a perfect like gap in the market, because actually not many people, I mean, as we said, there are people out there doing it. There's not many where just people can go up and be like, I've got this idea, will you write it for me? That's not generally mostly how the industry works. So we were like, well, this is a nice little niche for us to get comfortable, get established, and then produce our own games.
And I think what that meant was, for the first couple of years of working, we were always looking ahead. We were thinking, right, we're doing this for now, but later on, we're going to get into the meat of what we're doing later. And I think we've just sort of realised, actually, slow down, this is what we're good at. We're good at making games for other people. And if that means that we can use that to create space in our schedule to make a game for ourselves once in a while, then that's good. But really, I think the bread and butter of this job that we do, our studio does, is always going to be bespoke game design for other companies.
Yeah.
Because, as you say, it's a model that works. It supports us as a business. We're not having to gamble capital we don't have on loads of Kickstarters and things, and potentially get onto that Kickstarter treadmill that you see some small companies struggling with, where they lowball a Kickstarter in order to make money,
right? And
then need to do a second Kickstarter to fund the first Kickstarter, and then you can't escape that.
That seems to be a real problem in the industry to some extent, right? Amongst smaller companies. I haven't seen Simon's detailed accounts, but I do wonder a little bit if they're in a somewhat similar situation, right? Although certainly their products, you can't argue that Simon's products are underpriced.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I think the thing is as well is that you get trapped in it, but also there's this huge pressure from backers. It becomes this very stressful thing of like, how do you set your stretch goals? There's now this expectation that you always must have stretch goals. Not everyone does it, but most people do. You always must have stretch goals. You always must have some kind of good deal for the consumer. It's not just that they're getting the game, they're getting a cool bunch of stuff with it, and costing that and planning it out. And then the realities of costs changing, or just you get a slight miscalculation and that's it. You're borrowing money from your future self. And then you're stuck because you've already promised the game to however many people. It's like I saw recently, I think it was last week, shipment containers from China are going for like up to 10 times their price at the moment, because there's so few of them coming out at the moment because of everything that's going on. Sometimes it's double, but it can be up to 10 times. So there are lots of small companies who just can't ship their game. They just can't afford to. Unfortunately, it's just a risk that you have to take, and it costs a lot, and you can do it but by spending more money, and that means you need more money, which means you get stuck.
And I think another issue that kind of feeds into it is that a large chunk of the tabletop games industry is hobbyist led, by which I mean
Mm.
no one gets into manufacturing nuts and bolts because it's the thing they want to do. I mean, designing games, making games and that tends to be a thing people get into because they really want to do it.
Mm.
And so there tends to be a little bit of rose-tinted glasses, optimism around a lot of things. And so people will go, I really want to get my game to Kickstarter. And really what they want out of it is they just want to have their game made and out there being played by people.
Yeah.
And so they're kind of willing to go, well, I don't need to make a big profit as long as it's out there. And so they set their margins incredibly low, thinking, well, it doesn't matter if I don't make a profit. And then something happens, exchange rates fluctuate, border treaties change, whatever it might be. And suddenly they're now paying 10% more than they thought they were going to.
And their margin just can't absorb that.
And as they're a person by themselves, they're not a business, they don't have 20 grand of capital sitting around to just throw at a project necessarily.
Yeah.
And that's how these things can happen, I think. And even when a business starts finding its feet, a lot of the time the people working there will still be people who are first and foremost board game hobbyists who are doing this.
Mm.
You know, you're not necessarily going to get people coming in because let's face it, this is not an industry that you come into to make megabucks.
Yeah, it's a growing industry,
It is.
but it's not something that you're going to be an overnight millionaire with.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think people that are in it are maining it for the love of it, and that means that it's easy to have your heart broken, I think, and that can have financial repercussions, and that can really hurt a business.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because it sounds to me then, if we talk about the kind of few key issues there. So there's this kind of question that a lot of people who get into it because it's hobbyist led don't necessarily make, let's be completely honest here, the soundest business decisions, right? The problem is partly that they're saying, well, I'm doing this as a hobby, so I don't need to make money. And they're thinking, therefore, it's fine if margins are low. Whereas actually, that's not really that great because you're not considering all of the different things that can come along and screw you quite badly. I mean, shipping for one, for me, I can attest to that right now. I think in the end, we're going to spend something like $18,000 more or something on shipping than we really needed to originally.
Ouch.
It's very painful, but it's at the same time, it's like, well, there isn't really another option because we have to deliver it so that we can move on and do other things. That's not a cost a lot of people are in a position to necessarily just absorb that impact.
Yeah.
The second issue is one that I also found very interesting in what you were saying, which is that calibrating a Kickstarter campaign and things about planning around shipment, around stretch goals, even if you just give yourself a little bit of extra slack, what we're talking about there is like a whole set of expertise that's really completely different to the expertise of designing games.
Yeah. And you misjudge one of those. Like, say you go, if my game gets another 10 grand, I'll put minis in the game. And people think that's a cool stretch goal that they see everyone do.
Oh, woe betide them. Oh,
yeah. And it's like putting minis in the game might cost you 15 grand. And so therefore you've actually lost money. So you might have hit all your stretch goals and done a good chunk over. Actually, you're losing money now because you didn't realize that just paying for a single tool with 6 minis was going to cost you £8,000. Let alone getting them sculpted, let alone getting them concepted in the first place, let alone getting
reworking the tools that actually works.
And, it's just so much stuff. And you just think that you might get a quote from someone who says, yeah, I can do that for you. And they're trying to get your business. So they lowball the quote. And then you go back to them and then they're like, oh, no, actually, it's going to be...
sorry, no, that quote didn't include...
the one extra mini you've put in there now because of another stretch goal has pushed it onto 2 tools rather than 1 or whatever it is. And that's all it takes. So you have to highly calibrate it and really think about it. And it doesn't take much to accidentally step left or right and it be wrong, or you pitch your numbers wrong so it starts losing rather than
especially
making.
When so much of it can be guesswork. Like there are very few solid figures initially. You know, when you go to a manufacturer to get a quote, for example, you know, you won't know how many you need to be made. You don't know what the thickness of the card will be because you're planning on doing a stretch goal that will uplift the quality of your cards, whatever it might be. So you have all these kind of, it's like there's like a dark alchemy to working out, you know, a funding goal.
Yeah.
And you know what your pledge levels are, and then you realize there are these weird little points. Like for example, when we were looking at it in the past, we had a whole thing where the manufacturer would do quantities of 500, 1,000, or 2,500. It might be 1,000, 2,500, 5,000.
Yeah.
And if you go one copy above one of those levels, you have to pay for the next one up. And so you have these danger like pinch points where suddenly, if you do exactly 1,001 copies, your margins disappear.
Yeah, because you're having to pay for 2,500 copies.
Yeah.
But like, and I think it's even more dangerous because like you might be able to squeeze one extra game out of them by begging. But like, if you're getting to like 1,100, you're far too comfortably in that next bracket. And now that's it. You've made no money because you've had to pay for more than double what you wanted.
And none of this stuff is game design. If you're saying, I want to design a game, go and write my game, I'm going to go to Kickstarter, you don't think about it. You think, oh, I'll do a Kickstarter, campaign wins, yay, I get my money, I make it, right? And no, that's the start of the hard work. And then you have all this extra stuff to do.
And what we realised after all of that, as a roundabout way, is we didn't want to.
Yeah.
We didn't want to do any of that.
It's a minefield.
It is. It's stressful, and we tried doing it once, and it was a nightmare. And the fact is that just the amount of work we had to put into the prep for that one game, we could have made another game in that time.
Yeah. We want to put food on the table. We've got a 5-year-old. We've got a mortgage to pay. We are very lucky to be in a position where we can make games and get paid for it. So for anything to displace that time when we're doing that, it has to give us a similar kind of payback. Otherwise, we can't pay the bills.
If what we're doing already works, why are we trying to eventually get to a point where we're doing what everyone else is doing? Because what we do works, and we have a nice niche.
Yeah.
It's like a little niche.
But I think we're lucky. We're at the point where we're starting to get to work with people we want to work with. We're picking and choosing. We're able to turn projects down if they're not a thing we particularly fancy doing. So we're having our cake and eating it and just having a great time.
Yeah.
It sounds like a really great model for you to be running. You get to do game design, you get to secure income from it, which is something which only, generally speaking, a handful of game designers globally have something like a secure income from game design, where their royalties are so substantial that they're able to live off those. That's a very select club. How does it feel, though, the fact that maybe you don't always get to do that many of your projects? Because it's always someone else's ideas that you have to work on.
I really just wish we could do a thing that is completely 100% ours and have the ability to not dance to someone else's tune. Because when you do a project like this, you are very much designing something to a brief. And let's face it, 9 times out of 10, people want something they recognize. They don't want kind of wacky new ideas necessarily.
Yeah,
they want something which does a job that they recognize. They want a dungeon crawler or whatever else it might be that we all always get hired to do. And they want a thing where you have a bunch of heroes. Every player plays a hero. You fight against the AI deck controlled bad guys. It's like, well, we've done this a few times.
We've done quite a few of those now.
You start running out of ideas. And also, I think the thing is, we're never happy to just do the same thing.
Yeah, we don't. There's definitely design DNA, what we call it. Like, you can see, if you got all of our games next to one another, you'd see some themes. But we make sure that they all have a different way of running, a different way of playing, in a different way of winning. They've all got different strings that we're pulling on. It does get to a point where you're like, I don't want to do another dungeon crawler.
Yeah.
But at the same time, not that we're ragging on dungeon crawlers, because I really do enjoy doing them.
You just want the variety, right? Like, to some extent,
yeah,
it's the opportunity to explore different things. I mean, that's kind of the soul of creativity, right? It's novelty.
Absolutely. But what's lovely about working to a brief is the moment you have a brief, your job becomes easier as a game designer, because when you tell yourself, and this is actually something we talk about in our game design courses, when you tell yourself you can do anything, that's actually extremely intimidating. Like, do anything in the whole wide world. Just make
our
anything.
Game.
Yeah, it's so big. Where do you start? Where if you say to someone, right, okay, it has to fit in this size box. Well, that's actually a restriction. You're like, oh, okay, so it can't be on a giant inflatable bouncy castle.
Yeah, okay.
Zeppelin. Like, yeah. But that cuts off like one of those wacky ideas. And then you're like, oh, what we want is this, or using these miniatures, or set in this world. And you start it to give yourself challenges. And the moment you start giving yourself challenges, you can problem solve. And problem solving is what leads to game design, in my opinion. The problem is that if you've got anything, that is such an overwhelming amount of stuff. So even when you're designing games for yourself, in our game design course, we tell people, write yourself a brief, because even if you end up changing that brief and not doing that, it'll give you a starting point, like your first step down the road. And that is something that's lovely about our job. So we do miss the freedom, but also having the restriction is the thing that makes our job easier.
Occasionally we get a constraint on a brief where it is hell and we bash our heads against the wall repeatedly trying to make it work.
Oh, I can imagine.
Yeah, but at least at that point you can go back to the client and say, okay, this feels like it's not working. How solid is it? Can we tweak it? Can we change it? But even if not, that gives you an interesting challenge, which keeps it lively.
Well, I think a great example is when I worked on League of Infamy, there was quite a strict restriction on the amount of cards we had for like equipment. And I found that so difficult, and I wrestled with it for weeks. But what's actually come out the other end is a system where you sell back most of your kit and you only keep a couple of pieces, which actually avoids that thing you get in a lot of dungeon crawlers where you get like equipment bloat, where you just, by the time you get to the 5th dungeon, you've got everything. And you've got so much stuff, you can't even remember what all your kit does. And it's stacked underneath one another. And it becomes this thing where people don't really care about kit because it has no value, because you've already got everything you could get.
It's the same thing you see in like D&D, isn't it? When you get to like level 10, you're like, has anyone got a thing that will help with this? And everyone looks down this like 2-page inventory. Probably somewhere in here I've got some stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So, and actually what it did was it forced me to reassess all of those easy assumptions about dungeon crawlers, and actually made me come up with a system which I'm really proud of, which is a way where you sell back your kit, and that can give you some more renown. And it's a thing where infamy, it's a thing that actually makes the game better. But the restriction was extremely difficult and was a real challenge for a long time.
This is the power of creative constraint, isn't it? It forces you to be creative. In fact, actually, if you have no constraints at all you have is a vacuum. It's so interesting the way you say that, because I think when I think about all the kind of projects we're working on at Naylor Games, of which there are now probably 4 or 5 in the pipeline, with all of those, the most interesting part for me is once we've got past the very first initial concepting. It's the most enjoyable bit, because I think, as you say, game design is about problem solving. That's the part where it gets exciting, right? You've got the problem to solve, is where you're saying, oh, how are we going to achieve this particular objective, rather than just, oh, what thing in general could I make, which is just it's too general, it's too free. And yes, sometimes you have to renegotiate those elements, those constraints sometimes, because they just don't work, or it's not workable. That is life. But it's a great starting point. So on that point then, let's talk a bit more about those briefs. What do you include in those design briefs to make them highly functional?
As much as possible.
Yeah.
Basically, we will interrogate the client and get as much information as possible, to the point where it's like, how many players is this for? Are there any specific components? So like quite often people will approach us with miniatures and go, we've got a miniatures range and we want a game for it. So here's the miniatures we want to make. You need to accommodate that. Or they'll say, we want a game that, is no bigger than this, that takes this amount of time because we've noticed there's a gap in our market. Or they'll give us limitations, but then we'll push into the corners of that and be like, okay, so if we've got a miniatures game, do you want dice?
Yeah.
Because that's always an assumption that all miniatures games need dice. Or how do you feel about does it need to be 6-sided dice, or can we have like bespoke tooling on the dice?
Yeah, are you creating a starter set which includes dice, or are you just doing a book? So we look at the physical product they want to make. So if it's a miniatures game, a lot of the time it's just a rule book. If it's a board game, we talk about things like how big they envision the box as being, the RRP is, the rough player count is. And we ask them to give examples of similar games. And if they haven't got an idea on that, we will come up with that ourselves, and we will show it to them, and a lot of the time we write our own briefs and get them to approve it.
Yeah, they'll come up with like something that uses these models, and we'll ask them a bunch of questions where they're like, and then we come up and we'll go away and do a load of R&D and make some decisions based on a combination of our experience, what's popular in the industry. If they say they want an RRP of £70, but they want to have like 100 minis, we'll be like, well, what does that sort of game look like? Because that's going to be very different to a RRP of £200, because they'll want a more in-depth game, which is much bigger and much grander. And, what can we do for what they want?
A game that is written for 2 players is very different from a game that is written for 2 to 5 players. There may be a 2-player experience in there in both cases, but you need to think about what the game, what purpose it needs to serve. And there are things like, when we do things that are based on a license, we talk about which aspect of the license they want us to specifically key into. So for example, with Hellboy, it was very open. It was like they had access to the entire Hellboy range of comics, but they had already started making the miniatures. They want these particular models to be in the game. And so it was like, well, yeah, but do you want us to draw on themes and imagery from the entire run, or just from that part there? And that happens with a lot of things. So we did the Devil May Cry board game for Steamforged Games, which is based off the video game. And that was a very interesting one, because the board game experience, it's a multiplayer cooperative game, which the video game has never been, how do you want us to adapt that? Which parts do you want to keep? Which parts do you not mind changing?
Yeah, because you can't keep the complete experience, because the complete experience is not multiplayer and it's not
the skill in playing the Devil May Cry video game, as I learned while doing research for this and learned how much I suck at it, is carefully timed button presses and reading a situation around you and that sort of thing.
That's a single player experience.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is there a reason why they asked for a multiplayer co-op version of that?
We never asked why, but I would assume it is because solo games don't sell as well.
Okay.
And also you can include more minis, because you can be like,
precisely, you can have
this
more
can
characters
have
in.
up to how many players, so here's more player minis, you know.
As it happened, we included a set of solo play rules in the end, so you can play it solo, but it's still a very different experience. But yeah, absolutely, that is one of the things that we often ask, like now, especially, I mean, we briefed that one about 4 years ago, so it's one of the first projects which has gone. Now we are much more detailed in exactly what we want and why, and
sometimes it is just because the client wants to.
Yeah, but we will often interrogate. We'll say, why do you want to use dice? Why are dice the right thing? And if it's just because they've only ever played games with dice, we will then show them. We've actually had things where we've shown clients other games and played them through a couple of rounds. Back in the days when we could have meetings in our office, we used to often get a game out and play through a couple of rounds of things. Say, well, how about this?
Yeah.
And you can sort of see their brain ticking over. It's like, oh, actually, we don't need to have the thing we thought, we could do this instead.
Yeah, and I think some of it is just assumptions. Like, we all do it, we all make assumptions. Like, if I say to you, describe a board game, we all come up with a picture in our head, and that's what people assume. So we will interrogate assumptions to make sure that they're there for the right reasons. If someone says there has to be no more than 120 cards in the game because they've done the costing, and they don't want there to be more than that because then it changes the amount that it takes to produce, fair enough. If they've just picked that because it sounds like the sort of number that you should have in a game, then that's not a good enough. Well, not if they say it is, at the end of the day, they're the client. But like, that's not necessarily. Know that actually,
classic one is that, as I say, the way cards are made for games is, a certain number of cards based on size will fit on the card sheet. That's printed as one sheet, and the cards are cut out. So actually, the exact number of cards doesn't really matter. It's bands. If you go over 64 poker-sized cards, that's the second sheet. If you have 70 poker-sized cards or 90 poker-sized cards, it's generally going to be the same cost at the manufacturer, because they're just cutting out one big sheet and throwing away the rest or recycling the rest.
Yeah.
And that's a client might not know that. They might assume, well, I played Mice and Mystics and that had a deck of however many cards, so I'm going to suggest that is the number of cards you have in this game.
Exactly. So we just interrogate every detail we can. And sometimes people are very loose, and then we will go and decide limitations for the starting brief, and we will decide what the product should look like before we start. Or sometimes clients are extremely specific about what they want, and then that's a joy, because it's really easy to be like, okay, this is the starting point, that's cool. As we always say to the clients as well, is that sometimes things will grow. You'll get to a point where you're like, this game is different to the one we first started making, and then that's a point of checking in with the client and making sure they're happy with it. But sometimes it's actually just a case of keeping them up to date and then being happy with the process, and then us sort of mutually agreeing, oh, actually this would be better as 4 players rather than up to 5, or actually this is much better as a 2-player experience, or whatever it is. That becomes a dialogue. But the starting point is so key for the development.
So given that starting point, and then I'm going to ask you a slightly broader question based on that before we move on to more parts of the process, because there are things here I'm really interested to find out more about. What does product mean to you?
When we talk about the product in our process, it is the finished item that is sold on the shelf. So usually a game in a box with all the different pieces, shrink wrapped and complete and sold as it is. And that is that's the end point in our process. I think. Have you got anything other than that?
No, I would say it's really interesting, because we always, well, not always, but we quite confidently talk to clients about the fact that we do try and consider product limitations, as in, we can't have the box bigger than fitting on a Kallax shelf, because then it won't sell as well. Or we, so don't make a board that's 3 foot by 3 foot and doesn't fold up very well, because that just isn't going to be marketable. And we try and consider a lot of those physical limitations, as well as the conceptual ones of what is the game. But it's really interesting to be challenged, because we also don't do graphic design or art or any of those elements. We don't talk to the manufacturers about the 3D plastic trays that go in the box at the end. None of that is to do with us. So even though we consider those elements, it's actually not, we don't take it from concept to final product. We very much take it from concept to final game.
Yeah.
With a consideration to their needs, and then pass it on to the client, and they go away and make the game.
It would be nice if it was that clean cut, though. It doesn't always, which of course, and we always try to push to get like some elements of graphic design, layout, miniatures. We try to get that done during the process, because invariably, otherwise, you will try to get something laid out. And we're quite good at avoiding this now, but there have certainly been times when a graphic designer's gone, oh, we just cannot fit that much text onto a card, or actually that board is not going to fit in the box, or something. And that can cause issues, and we have to go back and rework things accordingly. But I think we're getting better at that.
You're not directly working with the artists and the graphic designers for the company. You're giving them, and then they're managing that part of the process.
Yes.
But by default, that's the way it works. As we work with some smaller clients, they might not have access to those things. So we will then either help them find freelancers and help them manage those freelancers, or we will suggest people and let them deal with it. But if we're working with people that have either got in-house artists, so we've done a lot of work with like Mantic Games and Steamforged, and they have complete in-house design teams. We just give them the files and step back.
And they will come back to us as well, because whenever a graphic designer is let loose on a character card, they might want to change the icons, because we just use default icons. Like if it's defense, we might just put a shield on there, and we get it off the internet, and we're not using that as a final product. It is a placeholder. So then they might come around and go, oh, I've redesigned the icon and I've put it in a different place on the card, and they might come back to us and just be like, what do you think of this? And most of the time we're like, yeah, that's fine. But we might also say things like, be aware that these cards are held in someone's hand. So try and avoid putting things in the bottom, bottom left-hand corner, or the bottom or make sure that you don't put all of your icons on the far left side of the card, because then they'll be really hard to see if you're holding them in a hand of cards. And stuff like that. Or we might be like, oh no, the text is really too small for people to be able to read that quickly in a game, so you're going to have to make that bigger. And so we'll give them some feedback, and that we're happy to have that back and forward. But we very much design the game with the expectation most of the time that people will take that away and make it into a product.
Although we have had situations, and we're actually doing it right now, where we're working with artists. The client is paying for the artists, you're managing them, because Sophie's got a whole background in like art management.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that.
Yeah. So I used to manage artists in a previous life, so that's why. It is a thing, but again, that's a service that we offer. Like that is a thing. When we discuss fees, we can say, well, we have the capacity to manage artists and freelancers and graphic designers. If that's something you want to opt in to pay us to do, but it's not a default part of what we do. It's just it's an option.
Is it easier or harder for you generally to have the more limited role in the process, where you're a secondary distance from the art and the graphic design? Is that the easier version of the process, or is it the way when you actually have a bit more control is easier?
Yes, it is far easier. From my opinion.
I think it cuts both ways. Like not having to manage it is lovely. Not having to actually have the pressure of doing that is great, but also losing the control can mean things happen. That I've certainly had experiences, even for larger clients, even when I was working over at Games Workshop, things where I've handed something over and stepped away from it, and then for whatever reason I haven't seen it until it's like the proofs are ready, and it's like, oh no, they've completely misunderstood what that thing's supposed to be. That can be quite, or they've changed something deliberately and it's not a change that I would have made myself, and that can suck. I mean, what I like to try to do is when we do a handover, we try to get the graphic designers and artists to play the game so that they know what the context is for the things they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And we always try and foster a positive relationship, so that we are there if they get something done 3 months after we've handed it over because they're working on the graphic design or whatever. We do encourage them to send it to us, just so we can get an eye over it, because there'll be just like silly misunderstandings, like you'll use a purple icon because you just were like, oh, that's a cool icon for a blood drop or something, and then they'll read that and go, oh, there's a purple dice in the game, so that must be a representation of the dice, or it needs to be purple as an icon.
That was a very specific example, wasn't it? That's from League of Infamy.
And it wasn't anyone's fault that happened, because it was both of us approached it in a completely logical way, just at completely different sides.
Yeah.
So it was just a misinterpretation of like, oh, that icon does not represent that thing. We didn't even notice that it was a weird color. We were just like, oh, that's a cool icon to use as a placeholder. But obviously a graphic designer or an artist might be very sensitive to the colors and shapes that you're using, where we don't necessarily think about that in the process. So having a collaborative experience is always easiest, whether that's us managing it or someone else managing it, but we can have that collaboration even if it's months down the line. And we always say, I know we've stopped working on this officially, but if you send us proofs through, we will check them through, we'll have a quick look. That doesn't mean we'll go through it line by line, because that's a completely different job, though, you know, editing and all of that, but we will quickly cast our eye over it to make sure there's nothing that stands out. Or there'll be just weird decisions, won't there, about like putting wound tokens on a character rather than taking wound tokens off, or stuff like that, and it can totally change the meaning of how you write a rule. And the graphic designer's just gone, this looks cooler maybe, but they won't necessarily understand the nuance of a rule or the way something's written. So we always like to check those things.
So my question on that then would be that if you could control more of the process, where actually you're the one who organizes for the graphic design and art to happen, and everyone's happy to pay for the extra cost of that service, would you in general prefer to work that way?
We have a very busy schedule as it is. And I think as long as we could manage it so that we had oversight with them and we had enough time to do that without it becoming our full-time job, because it can be a very intensive thing to do, especially if you've got multiple artists and designers. It can be a thing where it just eats your entire week up.
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah. It's a huge part of the process, right? Like this is another one of those things that, you know, people don't, when they think, oh, I've got my game on Kickstarter, they don't think about. That's a much bigger part of the process than the game design development.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
This is the thing. Designing the game, don't get me wrong, it takes time, but it's the easy part. It is the part that is most straightforward.
Getting a game made is so difficult.
Yeah, but I think like having if we had the ability to manage, I mean, we've always said, but we would love Needy Cat to grow a little bit. We'd love to get to the point that we've got a small office. We've currently got a small office, but slightly bigger than small office, with half a dozen people eventually maybe, and have an in-house designer, an in-house artist, you know, those sorts of things, where we've got a good working relationship with them. We know how they work. We trust them, and then we can kind of manage them in that sort of way. That would be lovely.
Yeah,
to get to that point.
To have one or two people, creatives in the office doing that would be amazing. And then you could get them involved in the early stages of the game design.
Yeah,
and that's when you start getting really interesting things, because we sort of bill ourselves. It's sort of like a catchphrase, although we don't even know the exact meaning of it. As we go, we are theme first designers.
You say that a lot.
but because we really want like the theme of a game to be baked into the design of it. So it's not just you make a game devoid of theme and then plop something on top, and then you just change some words to other words and you make the art that theme. So like in Hellboy, it was really important to us that when you used Hellboy in the game, Hellboy the board game, he felt like he was punching things like Hellboy would punch them. That was really important, and like key to the whole development of the core game system was, how do you make it so that Hellboy can punch stuff super hard? How do you make it so that Liz can also use flame stuff and it feel really threatening and dangerous for her to do that?
And I think more than that, it's also thinking about, you know, what is the structure of a Hellboy story? What sort of stories does it tell? You know, all of that, and then making sure that is in there from the start.
Yeah.
I know from playing Magnate, the theme is absolutely baked into every element of that game.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Yeah.
In fact, I was sat here when we played it. I'm in the same spot that when you brought it up, we played again.
Oh, amazing.
And I just thought, you know, it's a game that it puts you in the shoes of a property developer.
And
that's what we always try to do. We try to put the player in the shoes. It's not like, I mean, don't get me wrong, we have a lot of love for more abstract games. We play a lot of Euro games.
Yeah.
We play a lot of games where the theme sometimes feels like an afterthought, and we love them, but that's not what we like making.
Yeah. And I think that when you can get that collaboration where like the artist gets a chance to play very early versions, or the graphic designer does, not only do they get inspiration to, you know, that kind of, you need the early thoughts to just sit in the back of your head, so that while you're standing in the shower or something, you can be like, aha, there's an idea. And if you don't have that rumination time, I think you kind of rush that process a bit.
Yeah.
So getting that early exposure is really good, but also sometimes they just come up with really insightful stuff, because they're like, because this is, I don't know, insert theme here, because it's a dungeon crawler. It'd be really cool if, and they'll come up with something completely different that you can bake into the game at a really early stage. And that always ends being a better product. It always does. When everyone is bought into that from an early stage and you're all kind of having a bit of a hand in every stage, you do tend to get a better product out the other end. But it's so difficult to do that because when we're making a game and it gets handed over, we're making another game. And so we'll have a look at the game and give feedback on it. But it's not like we're there the whole process while they're creating the art and creating the graphic design. We might be play testing a game while another game's being written. So that games are at different stages.
It is a constant pipeline.
Yeah. And I can imagine it's a lot of projects because if you're a publisher, obviously if you're doing the whole lot, as I'm doing at Naylor Games, where we're doing the design, the development, then the briefing into artists, and then all the way up to production. One of the only bits we're not doing is actually physically making the product. If you've got all of that to do, you're obviously going to have a small number of projects given the same size team. So obviously you're going to have a more of a kind of a throughput. Now, I'm really interested in this question of kind of what the platonic ideal version of Needy Cat Games looks like, in the sense of your description of this having a small office, because it sounds a little bit to me like the role you start doing is like the role of product management. One of the interesting things that I found in the board game industry is this is a term people don't really use very much in board games.
Oh, really?
But in software is massive. And it's such a critical role in any software company to be the product manager, because in that situation, you're the person who decides what the objectives are, what the product should do, what it's going to be. And you shepherd it all the way from initial inception to delivery, and maybe including even some extent of the marketing, at least around the devising of the marketing strategy. What's so interesting about board games is how cut up the process is. So you've got like the designers who are coming up with ideas, and maybe there is no market for their idea, but they'll be pitching it all over the place, all the time.
Mm.
Your approach seems to me to be unusually holistic compared to maybe a lot of the industry, because you're doing some of the freelance art management at times with some clients, the smaller ones generally. You're helping the original people coming up with the ideas to actually tighten their ideas a lot, because you're saying you're writing the briefs to go back to them to say, do this, exact thing, really important stuff early on, like player counts, things like that, and box size, materials limitations, maybe even eventually manufacturing costs is something you might consider. And so you're doing quite a lot of that. And I just wonder how similar that is. And the reason I asked the question about product is because I'm always really interested to see what people think about that, because my definition is a little bit different. To me, the product is the totality of the box, the experience at the table, the price point, and the marketing channel. I think about it as the entire thing where the entire experience that I would exchange money for, because I feel like so many of what makes most games financially successful is that they deliver on a particular kind of experience for people, right? Like how Gloomhaven was probably monstrously successful because it was the first game that actually made you feel like you were playing one of those long form RPG video games.
Yeah.
Going back to the original thing you were saying about what's our platonic ideal, what is the thing we'd like to get to? I think we've been doing some work with some other designers and developers. We've got a small team of just freelance game designers who we know, and we try to work with.
A network, really, rather
it's a network rather than a team. But it's people that if someone approaches us with a game idea and we don't have capacity, we can farm it out to them, and then we do it through us. So the people have come to us because they trust us to do a good job. And so we will work with that freelancer to make sure it's up to scratch and it hits all the points in the brief. And we will use our experience to make sure it's as polished as it can be. But what I'd like to develop that to the point. Yeah, I think the ideal would be if we had a situation where we are, as you say, managing the product, but then we have a game designer, a game developer, an artist, an illustrator, a graphic designer. Then we partner with a manufacturer or something, and we have someone on the team who does all of that stuff.
Yeah.
That kind of is where I'd love to be, because that is where we have the freedom to dig in and get involved all stages of the process to a degree, but not have the obligation of doing it all ourselves. Because I think we're both people that would get bored of doing just one part of it all the time.
Yeah. I think that's one of the reasons why we wanted to be self-employed in the first place, was just doing the same job day in, day out for the rest of my life. 9 to 5 was just not on the cards for me.
Certainly this is never dull.
Yeah, this is never dull. And it's always changing.
Yeah.
It's always changing. We get so many different people approaching us for games. And we do occasionally do other little bits as well. We'll do like rules reviews, and
we've had the podcast, we've done the game design courses, we've We run the industry networking group that we do, which
yeah.
is up in Nottingham, it's kind of expanded since lockdown, which is interesting. We've got people from further afield now, but that was originally just because we were sick of going to shows and seeing colleagues in the industry, people that we knew in the industry, chatting to them for 5 minutes in a real rush, then going away and carrying on working, not seeing them again to the next show, and then realizing that they lived 5 minutes away from us. So we just started organising little get-togethers, and that's now, we've got about 300 people, I think, in the group.
I think it's more than that. I think it's
Possibly
way more than that now.
And we just offer, support and things. And it's a thing that we did because it seemed like a good idea. And it's one more thing we've done. I think we've been very keen to just try out different things. And
yes. And
that has helped us.
And different. It's like during lockdown, I made some demo boards for war games terrain, because I have that skill set. And someone asked us, do you know anyone who makes war games terrain demo boards? And we were like, no, I can make them. It was
an alarmingly long time between those two things. We'll go and have a look. We went and looked around. No one does. And then he said, Sophie, don't you do that? And you went, I do, yeah. Okay. And you sort of realised it.
I was like, that's the total thing. So during lockdown, it was just another string to our bow and another income stream. And so that was the thing that we do. And occasionally I do them now as an extra little bonus. Yeah. So we're very open to just giving lots of different things a try, which I think is really key when you're in a small business, is not to shut down opportunities too early, not to go, my company just does this one thing because that's the one thing I'm interested in. It's worth exploring around that, because actually sometimes you find weird little foibles that you're actually quite good at, little weird things that you can be like, oh, this is a thing that people want to pay me to do. Amazing.
And I think even in like 5-10 years time, wherever Needy Cat is, I would still like to have the freedom to do that. That's what I crave. I think I need that variety to function.
You're almost like that kind of the Google concept, isn't it, where they have the sort of 10% time or 20% time to work on non-job related projects. Yeah. Probably because they know they've actually got a lot of quite creative people who actually would get very bored if they weren't able to do things that are a bit different, right? Because this isn't just a 9 to 5 in the sense of like I have interests outside of work and this is just about paying for me to live. There are almost infinite better options than games for that, if we're completely honest, right? Like there's like
Absolutely.
Tabletop games,
Absolutely.
Relatively small industry, high levels of uncertainty, competing with other people who are happy to do it for love and not get paid. Not an ideal situation if you just want to make piles of money.
Yeah,
we've certainly seen a few people come into the industry saying, I'm going to leverage this industry, this growing industry, and make loads of money off it. And it's always like, you're not going to be here in 2 years, are you? And sure enough, they always tend to. They smart enough or they disappear.
It demands a lot of passion to push through. Because as well, it is still quite a young industry. I know it's been around for a long time, but in terms of the way it's growing, the speed it's growing at, in most of the industry, it's very new. Like there's a lot, like Kickstarter's still only been around for a decade?
Yeah, I think that's
it's not a long time.
Crowdfunding has remade this industry, and the industry that it is now is not what it was 10 years ago. In this current form, it's still very much in like an adolescent phase, I think, and nothing is certain.
Well, if we talk about board games, because I think the interesting thing is that there's this interesting division that I think is not always clear between tabletop war games, as pioneered really primarily by Games Workshop, and the broader board game universe, is that the broader board game universe is really young, right? Because actually, before the 1990s even, the idea of there being a kind of connoisseurship amongst hobby games didn't really exist.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like there's miniatures collecting before that. But, for example, I think even Games Workshop's most famous product, which is probably Warhammer 40,000, right? And that is 92, 91, I think.
Yeah, I think right about there somewhere.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's the sort of thing where before that point, board games were a thing you had in a cupboard at home. And when you went round to your nan's house on a rainy Sunday, you'd play a board game. Or they'd come out on Christmas or New Year. In the UK, we've always had a strong culture of that sort of board game and like parlour games and that sort of thing. But as you say, it wasn't really until 10, 20 years ago that people started being interested in hobbyist board games,
I remember many years ago, we used to visit Eclectic Games in Reading a lot. What I was so shocked with was they had all these board games in, which I was really excited about. But then they started doing like luxury board games, like luxury Scrabble and luxury Trivial Pursuit. And the thought of anyone being interested in having a deluxe fancy Monopoly set with like proper nice chunky wooden pieces on a nice wooden board that's been engraved. I just can't imagine anyone when I was in the 80s playing my broken Monopoly set that was missing half its bits, that anyone would have cared about that. Now, there probably obviously were people who cared about that, but the fact that that's come up so recently is like...
I think there have always been like high quality like Monopoly sets, but it's the general quality shift has moved towards that generally. People want nice games where it's not just a thin, flimsy piece of cereal board. It's nice, chunky cardboard and components that are nice to move around,
Well, again, it's the experience of playing the game, not just about the game outcome or the game story, but the physical experience you have while playing the game. Like Splendor, we've got a game, Splendor, and it's fantastic, but it's got like poker chips in it. And just physically holding the poker chips, they're so chunky and heavy.
Yeah.
They've got such a nice sound to them. And it's like, that's part of the pleasure of playing the game.
Yeah, completely. Well, where does all that mean that we're going then? Can this quality element just drift ever upwards? What does that mean for the future?
I think we're starting to see the rumblings of a split, because there's a lot of talk happening, a lot of discourse happening around the subject of games starting to price people out, where the push for quality and luxury experience is making board games quite inaccessible to people without a large amount of disposable income. So I think as the push for quality goes on, and that is driven by, for example, as we were saying earlier, Kickstarter. You want to have things for your stretch goals and make your game as nice as it could possibly be, but then that affects the retail price. I think as that goes on, we're going to see more of a market for budget board games. There was a company, I don't know if they're still going, but I remember there was a company called Cheap Ass Games, and they were basically they were sold like paper envelopes, and they were designed to be played with existing game components you had. So it assumed you would have access to dice, counters, playing pieces of some kind.
Yeah.
And you would buy it dirt cheap. And this is like cheap. Early days of the internet, really. So that they were mainly sold at conventions and things. And I imagine if the equivalent was now, that's what it's the print and play market now, basically. There was it was a rebellion against board games becoming more sort of luxury, and people always paying for the same. How many different types of meeple do you really need? The answer is lots. But there was that kind of pushback against that, and I think we will see more of that. And I think what's interesting is you're seeing the rise of print and play games, where you can go on the internet and find dozens of roll and write games you can download and play for free.
The success of things like Drive-Thru RPG and stuff like that as well, I think really is testament to the fact that people don't care about buying a fancy rulebook necessarily,
Yeah, but I think there's going to be that split. I think you're going to have the luxury market, and then you're going to have the budget market, and you're going to have the things that fall in between the two. I mean, certainly we're seeing the budget end. I mean, when you look at things like the custom-made board game tables, board game furniture and things, there are people who have enough disposable income. They want to have a really classy hobby. They want to be able to have a lovely gaming room that you go into and it's an experience. Then there are other people people at university or college or at school who maybe just want to just play games because games are cool. And there is everything on that spectrum in between the two.
I think what we'll get is more games that fulfill more niches. Because I think it's weird. Lots of people are like, oh, it's a crowded market. It's not at all. It's not at all. It's growing so quickly. I've heard people being like, oh, well, there's already so many Kickstarters out this month. Like how, and I do agree that Kickstarter, I think, is getting crowded.
The bar's raising, you have to stand out.
Well, that's the thing. But I don't think we'll see a drop in games being made. I think you'll just see games fulfilling different niches. Like you'll get more games that are similar to your £150 price point games, but being sold at 25, where it's all bits of paper and it's very low cost. It's
similar gameplay experience, but
and exactly. And you'll see people who are like, well, I want, and like the call for miniatures in games, well, that pushes the price up. But then you're going to get people who want those same experiences, but maybe are okay with chips.
I think Gloomhaven is a great example, because Gloomhaven is basically, it is very rare to see a game like Gloomhaven with mostly card standees. That is a thing where, and I know loads of people who say, I love the idea of it, but I won't play it because I like miniatures.
Yeah.
It's like, well, that's great, but that would be, I don't want to think how much that box would cost if every monster in it was a miniature.
It would be hundreds and hundreds.
Yeah.
Right. It would be like buying the complete pledge for Kingdom Death Monster, right? It would be like that, but like all of it for one pledge for Gloomhaven, because there are something like 30 or so monsters. There are something like 10 of each of the chips of the monsters. So that's already 300 additional miniatures.
Precisely. And what I will say, I mean, this is a tangent completely, but I think that putting miniatures in as a default isn't always a good thing. Because, yeah, of course, there are people that like miniatures, but you can do a lot more with standees. You know, if you've got like a legacy game, I think it's the thing that, what's the game? Charterstone did very well, which is it's a legacy sort of Euro civilization building game. That has a whole box of cards that you draw from. So certainly unlock new cards and bring them in. And some of those are little card-sized punchboard things, which bring new components into the game. And you can have standees on those. There's a lot of stuff you can do that miniatures can't get away with. And it would be interesting to see people veer away from miniatures to a degree.
I'm really interested to come back to this question about your view on the market and whether or not it's too saturated, because this is what I hear is the default thing people say. I think it's much more common to believe that the market is sort of saturated, that it's already there are already too many games, for example, than to say the reverse. So I think it's a really interesting, quite controversial statement in many ways that you said. And I'm really interested in exploring that, because I have a sense of the same thing. But I guess there are two ways in which markets can grow, right? So we actually know from the objective data that it's still growing. So it can't be saturated in the sense that something like the average European growth rate is something like 5%. And in China recently, I saw that the growth rate was 19% or 20%.
Oh my word.
In market size every year. So as probably Asia becomes the more and more center of all of this, that's going to become the really huge market. And there's still an absolute monster amount of growth left there. The question, I guess, that one might have, though, is the number of different games is a slightly different metric. So we've talked about Kickstarter might be saturated. What do we think about the number of different games being released?
I really do think that the industry is massively growing, and because there are so few people who still play board games as a like habitual thing, right? How many people do you know? Yeah, you probably, as your friendship group, if you know some people who are, because you're into board games, you have surrounded yourself with people who are into board games. But actually, beyond that circle, how many of your friends and family every weekend go, well, let's play a board game? And actually, that number of people, the people who play games sort of casually but still regularly, I think that's the group that are growing massively. More and more people are like, oh, well, we've got nothing better to do. I'll take my parents to the local board game cafe and we'll spend an hour or two playing Ticket to Ride. And that is a huge market that is, I think, almost untapped. And actually, a lot of the hobby board game world, as it is very niche and pushes down on niches. Let's put more miniatures in. Let's make it a more difficult dungeon. Let's go and make it more challenging with our escape room games. Let's go and dig down into this really, really deep lore about Lord of the Rings or whatever it is. Where actually, I think the untapped market is that the casual gamer who plays with their family, who gets more and more people involved that way. What games are they playing? Where are those games going to lead? And it's really interesting to see, like, if you ever go to a board game cafe on a Saturday afternoon, like we've got a couple local, and obviously current situation excused, but before everything sort of went bad, as it were, you used to see whole families, people who clearly are not board gamers, playing like Ticket to Ride and Clank and, you know, like I'm trying to think of some of the standard ones that they were always playing.
But you'd always have, like, there'd be Catan, there'd usually be a Monopoly out somewhere.
Yeah.
But you'd have like a variety of different. The thing is, like you say, it's like if you were to take a snapshot of the current audience for board games, if that were not to grow, then yeah, maybe we're reaching a saturation point. But the fact is, it is growing massively. You know, pushing into other markets. So last year, running up to the Kickstarter we ran, we had a marketing intern from the local university, Faria. She was wonderful. She was, I think, a master's student in marketing, and the university paid for her to come and do marketing for us. And she was from Pakistan, I forget exactly where, but she was saying, like, she had just started hearing about board games, like, becoming a scene out there. And she was taking back all this information, and, like, she was saying there is definitely an emerging scene. And so I think it is pushing into new markets. But I think also tied to that is you're seeing more voices creating games. So I don't know how familiar you are with nib card games in Africa.
Oh, yes, I've heard of this, yep.
Okay, so I want to say, is it Nigeria? Somewhere, my geography is terrible, but they set up a small board game convention. And I remember this about 5 years ago or so, and they started having, it was basically their village did a board game convention, and they had a load of imported board games, and they'd get people from all over to come and play. And now they are producing their own board games. They have a board games cafe, which is really popular. And what's really interesting is you look at the games, and the themes and the gameplay are very different to what you see in games that are produced in this country or in Europe or America. There's one of the guys that came on our design course designs games. He's over in India, and he has a whole bunch of games. He did a showcase on his YouTube channel. I'll dig out the link. You can put it in the show notes. It was a showcase of Indian designed board games, and again, the themes are so dramatically different. And whereas there's always been, so India and Africa have always featured heavily in Western board games, now you're getting board games created by people that actually have an authentic voice to make those games.
Absolutely, and they're from a very specific perspective.
Yeah,
often of not a great perspective.
There's the whole thing about colonialism in board games, isn't there? That's a whole discussion in itself.
And also, even and you look at these new emerging worlds, and it sounds really corporate to be like emerging markets, but there are whole new worlds of what board game design even means and how it works. Like that convention you mentioned, there is like a whole culture now. Like there's a whole like indie game design scene, isn't there, where people like make their own games out of whatever they've got around their house. And there's like a whole culture of it now, where there's more and more people just making games as a hobby. And you just think this is the direction that games can move.
You should try and get Casey on here, who runs Nibcard Games, because I'm sure he would have some fascinating insights.
It sounds like an absolutely fascinating conversation. Well, I have to say, this entire conversation has also been incredibly fascinating, and I'm finding it very inspirational, actually, because I think it's really interesting to meditate on those larger questions of market. I'm really aware, though, that we're rapidly running out of time. So what I would like to do is actually go to some listener questions next. Obviously, a thing you've mentioned before is you run these tabletop design workshops. So he had a question about how your switching to online workshops has changed your approach. He asked what things are easier online and which ones are kind of easier face-to-face.
We used to do workshops in person. We used to run a series of 3 like full-day seminars, which were in person. They were, I think they had 12 people as a maximum in each one.
Yeah, it might have been 15.
12, 15,
it was not much.
And we had a buffet. It was a nice kind of full-day event, and we always ran it. So the morning was theory and the afternoon was practical work. So they would do stuff based on the stuff we'd done in a theory session. Moving it online obviously changed that quite a bit. For a start, we were able to have more people coming down. We still tend to keep the events to about 30, I think, or so, but because you don't have to physically cram people into a room, that's a bit easier.
And we started breaking it up more. Because the thing is we were very aware when we did it in person that people would be traveling to attend them. Yeah. So the last thing you want is to do, well, we decided we didn't want to do let's do 6-hour-long sessions, because then that means people have to travel or they're just not going to do it. So we made it these big long day events, but it actually meant that we could make the sessions themselves a little bit more manageable by just breaking them up into smaller chunks. And also more coherent. So, I mean, initially the 3 things we did one which is about kind of the very first steps, getting an idea out of your head and onto paper and onto the table and playing a game. Then we talked in the middle one about refining your idea, and the third one was about kind of manufacturing and production, that sort of thing. And part 2 in the middle had kind of a lot more to it. It really, the whole process of developing and refining a game is a massive subject, but we felt the need to make the days quite thematic. So when we moved it to online, we went with 6 parts, 6-hour-long seminars. We ran it weekly. And part 1 is still about getting the ideas out your head onto the table. Part 6 is still about what happens at the end. But parts 2 to 5 had room to breathe, so we could spread out that middle part of the process. It's the same information delivered in a different But I think it's probably a bit more accessible, especially for people who can't sit and concentrate for hours at a time. Because even us, at the end of the day, we were just shattered. So it was quite an intensive experience. I think the thing that makes it difficult, though, is not being with people in the room because we used to put people, we warned them that we were going to do it. We did tell people you're going to be put on the spot. But we used to put people on the spot after we'd done the first theory session and be like, right, okay, now make a game. And people would be like, what, make a game? And we're like, don't do the thing you've had your heart set on for the last 10 years. Don't do the main idea. Make something completely new up.
Here's a pile of components,
Yeah, here's a bunch of scrap paper, because we a big theme of our the initial getting out your head is just scrappy, don't commit to it, don't put too much effort into it. But the moment it's out of your head and it exists, then you can change it and make it better. If it never comes out of your head, if you never write it down and you try to theorize the whole thing before you make it, which is what a lot of people do, is their first stumbling block, then it doesn't exist. So it's not a game and you can't make it better. So we do this whole thing of, but being physically in the room with people, you could be like, just write it down. Just write it down.
Whereas like the equivalent of the practical sessions in the online courses, we have almost like homework assignments. Like you can go away and do this thing before we look at the next one. But of course, we're not in the room able to say, make sure you do it, because so many people came out of that first session saying, oh my God, I hadn't realized that if I just give myself permission to make something that might be a bit naff, but it's complete, or it's playable, it's such a liberating feeling.
Yeah.
So many people got so much out of that process.
And the games they made were fantastic.
Yeah.
Every single game had clever ideas. Every single game had great potential. Yes, they weren't finished. Yes, they were clunky because they were first ideas. But oh my goodness, the stuff that we saw, we were like, this is so inspirational.
And so it's a shame we can't have that in the online course.
Yeah, that must be challenging.
Because what you do get is you get people going, right, so this is the thing I've been working on for 10 years. And I'm thinking this or this. And you have the forums. Everyone's like, well, just make it. And they're like, oh, well, not until I've worked out how this stage was. You're like, just make it. If you were in a room, I would tell you to put that to a side, and I would put a piece of paper in front of you and make you draw a box. Right, that's your playing space. Right, now let's get something in there. But you can't do that online. So that is the one thing that I think you lose. But apart from that, I actually think it is a bit more digestible.
And I think the trade-in is that we're much bigger on the ongoing support. So we invite all the attendees to our Discord server, and we've got a room that's locked just for them. Mm-hmm. And if they need any ongoing support, questions, whatever, we're there for them. And there's a whole lovely community springing up of game designers who are really supportive of each other as a result of it. So it's not quite the same, but I think it still works really well.
What do you do to cut loose when you've had a stressful game design related issue?
We usually go to the pub afterwards. It was actually about a month ago, or whenever it was, you probably dated it quite specifically. We'd had a really, really tough day, a couple of tough meetings.
Very mentally challenging. When we say tough, we mean those days where you feel like your brain's falling out your ears and you're just like, I've just used all my brain power.
And Sophie just said, I wish we'd go to the pub. And they just opened. I was like, we can go to the pub. And so we did. So we went and we sat outside and very cautiously looking around at everyone suspiciously and, flinching away from human contact. But we did, and it was quite nice. We had a couple of drinks. One thing that's interesting is because we live together as well, it can be hard to switch off, especially if we've had a rough day. Like, to not take that home is difficult.
That must be very, very challenging. Also, because I can imagine if it's a particular issue both of you really care about, you're going to instantly be like, oh, I just had this idea about this. And you're thinking this might be time when you almost really want to segment it a bit and not talk about work. I mean, do you have some kind of no shop talk rule? How does that work?
We try.
We should have, shouldn't we?
We try. We're a lot stricter on it these days than we used to be. A lot stricter, because we used to just work all the time and do late nights as often as we could, or go in early, or one of us would go in early while the other one took Lily to school, and then we'd catch up. But we've actually very much got a quite strict 9 to 5 and Monday to Friday working schedule. We try really hard not to book in meetings around that. Obviously there are issues with people in America and stuff, but that's relatively it. We do have things where we're now a bit more conscious. So I might go, I've got a great idea, I need to tell you so it's out of my brain. And then I'll say the idea, and then we'll have a quick chat about it. I'll be like, right, I'm going to write that down, and then we're going to put that on the shelf again.
We've often had things like Robot Fight Club, which went on Kickstarter last year, that started when we decided we're both exhausted, let's go out and get some sushi. And so we went out and got a bite to eat, and just because we didn't have to think of anything else, we were like, oh, you know what we could make? And it suddenly immediately was back onto a work conversation, and that happens so much.
Oh God, yeah.
So we are a lot better.
Try.
And we are a lot better than we were. When we go to the pub, it's less about needing a drink and more about changing the setting. So it's about getting out of the office and getting out of the house, because
and seeing other people occasionally.
Like, it is difficult though, because if I've had a really tricky, challenging day, I desperately want to see my friends, but the last thing I want to do is play a board game.
It's impacted our board game playing a lot, because
I bet
as soon as you start designing games, I'm sure you've noticed this, you now can't switch it off. You can't not see the production qualities of a game, or think, oh, how do they make that component, or whatever it might be.
Work out, I remember there was one Christmas where we were like, oh, we're just going to play, it's like a family thing, and someone had a thing called Triopoly instead of Monopoly, and it was like a 3-tiered knockoff version. It was clearly a cheap cash in, and someone had it, and we were like, fine, we'll just play it because it's not to do with work. And I was getting really annoyed because it was just really boring. And I was just sitting there going, well, the sides of the board are only 8 long instead of 10 that you normally get in Monopoly. So when you're rolling 2 dice, the average roll is 7. So you're just landing in the same places in the board every single time.
And we had a good, we picked it apart, didn't we?
Yeah,
we didn't really mean to. We were like, oh.
I couldn't not.
We should be playing a game.
I couldn't not. I was just getting annoyed.
I bet this made you very popular.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
But it's just stuff like that where I was like, well, if they did a single dice roll or different decided dice, this would be a problem.
Yeah.
But you immediately start thinking about those things. So it is tricky, but for us, it's changing of situation. We're very, very, very lucky as well that we have a park literally 5 minutes walk from our office. So when we're getting really stressed, with the thought, the way that we're thinking is getting a bit overwhelming, or we've got too much work and getting a bit stressed out, we go for a walk. And going, just again, changing the scenario, changing the place we are, being able to just walk around a park is so good to reset and to de-stress. And having a dog now, we have an office dog called Rosie, and she forces us to get out of the office on a regular basis. And we'll take Rosie for a big long walk. And when we come back, we're reset. So that really helps.
Fantastic. So you've got Rosie to make sure that you take walks regularly. I mean, I think that's probably great advice for anyone, to be honest, in terms of, I think, de-stressing. I think going for a walk in a green space is pretty much fantastic, I think, every time.
Or get a dog. That's the other way to de-stress.
The other one. Well, it forces you to take the walk as well, isn't it? That's the advantage.
Yeah,
That's the advantage of that. So I guess we kind of then wrap up then. So what should we be looking for from you? Is there anything that we should be on the lookout for from Needy Cat Games coming soon?
So we're currently working on a game called Myth and Goal for Blacklist Games. That is it's like a fantasy sports-based kind of thing. It's an interesting one because it's springing from a set of miniatures they're making, which can be used in games of Blood Bowl being a popular Games Workshop game, third-party miniatures being a big thing for that. So our challenge was to make a game that used miniatures that were compatible with Blood Bowl, but for my own personal benefit, having worked on Blood Bowl, was nothing like it. And so that was it's very different. It's more about team management than...
Yeah, I'm really excited about it because it sort of forces you to think about the flow of the game and looking after your players and switching players out when they get exhausted and things, rather than it just being about individual players taking hits or whatever. It's a really interesting take on the genre.
So we've got that. We've got...
There's some stuff we can't talk about, which I'm super excited.
Always the way games
I'm so frustrated. Every game I work on is one I'm not allowed to talk about until it's released.
Those NDAs, eh?
Yeah, absolutely. But also, I mean, actually, one thing that is quite cool, Sophie has been making, she said, gaming tables for a while. And she started putting them up on TikTok because she's young and relevant.
And
there's quite a nice little hobby community on there, people with big into board games and tabletop games and things. And you're about to start making a new board, which you're going to be live streaming.
Yes, I'm going to be making a Blood Bowl board, and I'm going to be live streaming it on TikTok. Sophie Makes Terrain, so you can come and check me out if you like.
Yeah.
So there we go.
And that's as much as we can really talk about right now. Obviously, our game design courses are available at needycatgames.com/tickets, and we've got kind of two things. We've got the Game Design Online, which is the 6-hour online conversion of the one that we did originally. And that's mainly fantastic because I have a massive lockdown beard.
Yeah.
So that's good. And then also I did one a few months ago, which goes more into signing up miniatures, war games and things, which is a thing that's quite close to my heart. So yeah, those are all up there. People can check those out if they'd like to.
We've got some more things coming, hopefully, in that regard as well.
Yeah.
So watch this space.
Watch this space indeed. Oh, well, thank you so much again for joining me. It's been really fascinating, and I hope we get another chance to have another conversation about the industry sometime soon.
Oh, thank you.
Producing Fun is produced by Naylor Games. If you enjoyed the show, follow us on Spotify, Stitcher, or other major podcasting platforms. Remember, Producing Fun is also a product, and it thrives on feedback. So please leave a review wherever possible, or simply send me your feedback directly. You can message me on Twitter @NaylorJames, or write me an email, james@naylorgames.com. Until next time.